Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. On the phone with me today, I have Alexandra Dickinson in New York. Alexandra is an entrepreneur who teaches people to negotiate. She's the founder and CEO of negotiation training and coaching company, Ask for It. She's a contributing writer at Forbes, and she's spoken at organizations like UN Women, Columbia Business School, and Facebook. She'll be speaking this year at South by Southwest on the topic, Time's Up on the Gender Pay Gap, How to Negotiate in 2018. Alex, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, I am so excited to talk to you. I'm excited to hear you speak at South by Southwest. But before we get too far, I'm really curious, what inspired you to begin teaching other people how to negotiate?
So negotiation is something that you probably wouldn't have seen on paper in my background before I started the business, but is definitely something that has always been part of my personal life and something that I sort of was informally, I think, pretty skilled at before I started studying it. I started the company actually as a side hustle when I was working at a 9-to-5, feeling kind of unfulfilled. And then I was unexpectedly laid off from my last job. And so I decided to take my side hustle into my full hustle. And I thought, okay, I'm going to see if I can make something of this and make a business of this. And I'm going to put my full effort into it for a year. And if I get no clients and make no money, hopefully I'll still be employable by the end. So I'm proud to say that I'm in my third year now. So, some things are going right.
Oh, that's excellent. That's excellent. So I'm curious, you mentioned that it's something that was always part of sort of your background, although maybe it didn't show up on your resume, so to speak, I guess you could say. How did you sort of personally come into negotiation? I mean, is it something you grew up around? Is it something that you learned to do through getting job offers? Like, where did it really come into play for you?
A lot of different places. Hard to say just one thing, but some people are oriented towards one thing versus another. So my professional background prior to starting my company is communications and training. So my undergrad, my grad degree, all my decade of professional experience before I started the company was communications and training, and you could really say negotiation is a specialty within that. So something that I grew up around, something that I just have always been oriented to. And when I started the company, I was focused a lot on working with women. As you sort of can tell from the title of my South by talk, I'm moving away from gender-specific advice because I'm just tired of giving it. Mm-hmm. I'm tired of telling women we have to do something differently, and I think that the moment has passed for those behavior-based techniques, and so I'm not talking about them anymore. But that was definitely, 3 years ago. This is before Me Too, before Time's Up, right? And very much still in the lean-in moment. I was really focused on helping women have more success and helping women overcome the obstacles that we face in the workplace. And clearly we're still facing obstacles, but I'm giving the same advice now to everybody, which is respectful, evidence-based, not about like smiling the right way or, seeming warm and friendly. I'm moving away from that sort of advice. But that was a big part of the impetus for why I started too.
Oh, that's great. Well, so as we think about negotiation, sort of big picture, are there a couple of times career-wise that are the most important times that we should be negotiating?
Any time that you change jobs, always from your first job on till forever.
Okay.
People think, I should be grateful for that first job. That's definitely advice I was given, which is bad advice in my view. Not that you shouldn't be grateful, sure, but not that you're thanking them for like the crumbs that they've given you either, right? So you should always be advocating for yourself at all times. So anytime you change jobs is a really important time to do it. Anytime you have a performance review that's like baked in, that's another important time to do it. But anytime that you feel like you've accomplished something really significant, then you want to speak up and take credit for your great work. We maybe are hoping sometimes that our managers are thinking about how our careers can progress and how They can reward us, and that's a little bit of wishful thinking because everyone's looking out for number one. Your manager is also thinking about his or her own career, right? So not that great managers aren't out there. They certainly are, but just that waiting to be recognized, which is a trap I think a lot of us fall into. Oh, if I just work hard and keep my head down, eventually someone will notice. Like, not necessarily. Don't be waiting for that. Always be speaking up when you've accomplished something great.
I think you make a really good point because I think a lot of us were taught that if we just work really hard, things will come to us and that you don't need to ask for them. And I think you're absolutely right that that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, it's just not a thing. I mean, it sounds great and it's definitely an ideal, but it's just not the case for so many people. So why not take the opportunity to take your destiny into your own hands?
Yeah, absolutely. You also mentioned the idea of a first job and, being grateful for it, but not so grateful. I think, I speak to a lot of people that talk about, well, I just want to get my foot in the door at this company. So I'm willing to not negotiate to get my foot in the door. And once I've proven myself, then I can negotiate. But I think you make a really good point that you should be negotiating right up front.
Yeah, I would completely disagree with that. I mean, you negotiate to show your employer that you have that skill set in your arsenal, and you do it to show them that you take yourself seriously and that you value your skills. I mean, just accepting the first offer that they make to you makes you look like a novice. It makes you look like you don't know what you're doing. So I would just totally disagree with that.
I love that it makes you look like a novice. I think you're right. I think they tend to have more respect for you if you, ask for what you're worth. Well, so I'm curious, what do you find as you're talking with folks, what do you find is a common sort of misconception about negotiation? Like, what do we think about negotiation that's not quite right?
Oh, there are so many, but I think the biggest one is that it's going to be a fight. I'm going to win, you're going to lose. Or I have to be really aggressive, or I have to be really slimy, or any of these like negative sorts of feelings that we have. It's going to be awkward, uncomfortable. It's going to make me feel greedy. These are all things that I've heard from my clients that's how negotiation makes them feel. I like to think about negotiation as a creative problem-solving mindset. Even in a situation where you are about to accept a new job, right? You might think that you're so lucky that they're hiring you, and that may well be the case. I'm not discounting that, but the fact is, you want the job, but also they want you. Don't forget to think from that other perspective, because they have gone through lots of candidates, interviewed different people, and decided that you're the person that they want to make the offer to. So you have some amount of agency in that situation too. So using the creative problem-solving mindset means that it is about, I have a want and a need, and you also have a want and a need, and we're going to find a way to make this work together. It's not about, I'm going to win, you're going to lose. I'm going to get, people always have this feeling of tension between they want the highest possible offer and the company wants to give them the lowest possible offer. It's just not always the case, right? You want it to be a fair offer for your skill set in your marketplace, but that doesn't mean that it's about, someone's taking advantage of somebody else, which is just something that I hear so frequently.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it seems like if we go into a new job and whether we feel like we were taken advantage of or they feel like they were taken advantage of, the hiring manager, it doesn't seem like it sets us up for a very good future employment relationship. So I like the way you talked about, it's like a creative process. We're looking for something that works for both parties.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, this kind of makes me think back on, a few years ago, I worked with a client who, interestingly, was becoming a minister in Texas. And it was his first time to be a minister. And so the church was giving him an offer that was very low. And their argument was, you're very young, you're very inexperienced. And he had a very hard time asking for more, but he really needed more because the area where he was living, it was so expensive that if he didn't have a little more, he wouldn't be able to live close to the church where he was working full time, and he couldn't have as much sort of interaction with the congregation. And so it was really interesting because I think he had to kind of psych himself up to think about what did he bring to the table. He might bring new church members. He might be able to bring in new donations. He might have a new perspective. And like you said, he was the person who they selected. So it was a really interesting process, especially in an industry such as church where money is something that's not talked about. But it was interesting to see because once he asked for that, he asked for a reasonable amount, they were willing to give it to him because they wanted him to be the person that they hired. So it was a really interesting sort of give and take going through that process.
Yeah, I would say that those personal elements of this is what I need in order to make my financial life work, you do need to understand them, but they're not something you ever would bring up in a negotiation because your counterpart, the person or the organization that's hiring you, they are fully not interested in, the cost of living in your city or whatever. So you have to understand what their priorities are and make it about them and make it about what skills you're bringing and not about how much your rent is increasing. So I think that's also a common thing that people struggle with because they want to give this reasoning like, well, I need this much because of this reason. And it's a personal reason and it's just not relevant.
Yeah, I totally
you have to make
agree.
it about professional. Exactly.
Mm-hmm. In his case, that was more of his internal dialogue rather than the case that he made. But it was just kind of an interesting dynamic to kind of see play out. But I'm curious, as we're kind of preparing for a negotiation, from your perspective, how important is research, in getting ready? And how do you do research as you prepare for a negotiation?
Research is the most important thing that you can do to prepare. Aside from practicing, I think practicing is also extremely important and something that almost nobody does. But research is absolutely critical because you can't just pick a number out of a hat and say, oh, well, I like this. This sounds good to me. I'll tell you that in my younger years, I've tried that and it's really not effective. So, I really take issue with the phrase that people love to say, which is like, ask for what you're worth, how much you're worth. I like to make a distinction because I'm a human being and I am priceless and so are you. You can't put a number on me. You can't sell me at an auction, right? I am not worth any particular amount. I am priceless. My skill set in the marketplace, however, does have a price. Mm-hmm. And so the research that I advise people to do, yes, when I ask people, oh, what is the first thing that comes to your mind when you think about research? Everybody says Glassdoor. Listen, Glassdoor is a great place to start, not knocking it. I personally also love PayScale. I also love Comparably. The internet is a good place to start your research. It's a really poor place to stop your research. If you only look on Glassdoor or other websites, you're not going to get a full picture. So I advise people to actually talk to people in their networks who would know how much this job makes. That means somebody who does that job now at your company or at a competitor, someone who's done that job recently and been promoted or moved on to something else, or somebody that hires for that job. So if you know HR people, recruiters, or people that are in leadership roles, people that hire for that job, those are good people to talk to. And I know it sounds like taboo and scary and intimidating, and I was taught never to talk about money, politics, and religion. I mean, I'm not going to comment on politics and religion, but what I will say about money is that if you don't talk about it, the only person that loses out is you because you don't have enough information. When you talk to people, I also say specifically make sure you talk to women and men, whoever you are, because there is a gender pay gap, there's a race pay gap. So make sure to talk to a variety of people when you're doing your research to get a sense, because you may find that depending on who you talk to, they could be doing the same job, but they could be making a dramatically different amount of money. So you want to use the higher numbers that you hear, obviously, and you just ask them in a straightforward way. I'm doing research because I'm changing jobs. I think you have some information that could help me. Would you be willing to share your ballpark salary with me? That's it. 3 sentences, really straightforward. It's not about being curious. It's not about being comparative. You're asking this person specifically for a reason. And I'll tell you that there is no substitute for the feeling that the fire that's going to be lit under you when you find out that somebody who you think has the same skill set is making 20% more than you, that's going to be really motivating in a way that seeing a range on Glassdoor is just not going to be. So always take it to the next level and always talk to other people in your industry, in your city about your skill set and what they're making. And, you're asking for a ballpark. It's not about every last nickel, diamond, penny and their bonus or their, other incentives or whatever, right? You're asking for a ballpark, and it's really, really important to do that. It's really, really important to talk to a variety of people as part of your research. I like to say half a dozen is a good rule of thumb.
Oh, that's interesting. And when you ask people their salaries, or, you kind of are doing this research, how open do you think people are to kind of sharing that information? If you're straightforward and you say, I'm switching jobs, are they fairly open to that?
I've never been turned down.
Oh,
and I've asked
good.
many, many people. Yeah.
That's really good. Well, so say that we've kind of done our research. We've talked to the half dozen people and we've been looking on Glassdoor. And we find that there's a range, because I've noticed for some jobs, there can be a pretty big range. How do we decide sort of where we fall on that spectrum? I mean, do we take our education into account, our experience? How do we determine what we should ask for?
I mean, yeah, of course there's going to be a range, because not everyone's going to make literally the same amount of money. As long as the range isn't gigantic. I mean, if it's a $100,000 range, that's really big. But if it's, a $40,000 range, I would just start at the top, because, they'll come down if they need to. People are so worried about asking for too much. If you've done your research so that you are at least in the right ballpark and you're not completely out of bounds, right? You're not asking for $150,000 when they're going to offer you 70 or something. I'm just making numbers up, right? That's a pretty big far cry. As long as if they're going to likely to pay 70 and you start asking for 90, maybe that's going to get you closer to 80. Most jobs have a range, and starting a little bit high, as long as you've done good research, helps you get towards the top of the range. It's not, people are so worried, oh my God, they're going to rescind my offer. If you're not over the crazy line because you've done good research, then typically what they'll say is, that's too high. How about this? So I wouldn't agonize over that too much, as long as you really genuinely have done the research. Some people have, cases where it's not straightforward. It's hard to get good research. In those cases, you have to kind of go with your gut a little bit. And some people, want to be more conservative. I would say just don't be too conservative. Don't be so conservative that you're undershooting. Because, especially, changing jobs or bringing on new clients, those are your biggest opportunities to get a bigger bump. It's harder to, once you're in somewhere, you're going to get that 2% cost of living raise if you're lucky. And, it's going to be harder to get a bigger bump. So take that opportunity if you're making a change to, try to get towards the top end of the range, as long as you have the skill set and the experience to back it up. You have to be able to talk about your strengths, talk about value that you've created, value that you've saved, really fluidly, so that you can make a case that you're worth it. But I would say, start higher in general, because most people that I have heard from, right, if you're a super go-getter, aggressive person, maybe this doesn't apply to you, but many people that I hear from are much more likely to go the conservative end of the spectrum. So I try to compensate a little bit and tell you, don't be so conservative. Make a good case for yourself, start a little bit high, and they'll bring you down if necessary. But sometimes you might surprise yourself.
Yeah. Well, so you just made a really good point that I want to be sure that we talk about it just for a moment, which is the difference between negotiating once you have a job, within your current company, and negotiating when you're moving to a new company. And you mentioned that when you're within your current company, you may be lucky to get the cost of living increase of 2 or 3% a year. I very often talk to folks who, at least initially, have it in their mind that they don't want to switch companies, and they're just sure that they're such a hard worker that they can surely get their boss to give them the 30% raise that they deserve to do the exact same job. And I'm just curious, what has been your experience with this when folks are wanting to negotiate within their current job? Does it ever work, or how often does it work?
Of course it works. It completely works. And I've worked with people that have gotten 30% raises. But those were people that were underpaid and made a good case for, they either had taken on more or they had new information. It's not impossible at all, but you have to make a really airtight case that is easy for them to say yes to. So you have to prove your value. You have to prove your, place relative to the market. And if you've taken on, let's say, somebody left your team and you've stepped up and taken on a leadership role for the last 6 months, but you haven't been compensated for it, and you're essentially acting as a higher level position than you are, that's a good time to ask. I think if you just think, I'm doing a good job and therefore I want 30% more, good luck to you, because that's going to be a hard case to make. And, but so it's circumstantial. If you've taken on something new or you've gone above and beyond, those are times when you can make it, or if you find out that you're underpaid relative to the market, relative to other folks in your company, those are times you can make a good case. So not impossible by any means, but it has to be the right timing and the right circumstance.
When you say timing, is the performance evaluation the right time, or are there other times that would also be appropriate?
Yeah, performance evaluation is a fine time. What I would say is that a lot of times your manager has like a pot to work with and multiple employees. So that may not be the time that you're going to get actually a bigger bump. Off cycle might be a better time to ask for a bigger bump, again, if you can make the case for it. So, every company is different, so you have to do a little intel about how it works at your company, but that's something that I see frequently. Performance evaluation, there's the company has a certain amount that has to go around, basically. So you might get a bit more than your colleague if you've been doing an excellent job, but oftentimes, there's a range. You could get a bonus, and your bonus could be funded from 15% to 150% or whatever the case may be. So varies by company, but typically performance review may not be your time to get that giant bump. You may have to get a giant bump off cycle, again, if you can make the case for it.
So when you say make the case, do you mean you're setting up a meeting with your manager and you're going in with a presentation you're presenting, or how do you typically advise people to start this conversation?
Yeah, so it is a conversation. I don't think that you have to go in with a deck. Some people want to do that, and maybe that's the culture, that's what your manager expects. That's fine too. Definitely, you want to have supporting evidence that you can share with them in some way, even if it's via email and a follow up. But yeah, you set up a conversation. I'd like to talk about my future at this company, and talk about my performance and compensation. Let them know. Don't surprise them with don't just pop into their office and say, hey, I'm hoping to get a raise. Can we talk about this? That you're going to talk about it. And you have to make the case for why you're worth it. So, that's value that you've created for your organization, value that you've saved for your organization, what your strengths are, how you've helped your manager achieve their goals, overcome challenges, what problems you've solved, or if new information a little birdie told me that so-and-so is making 20% more than me, and I'm underpaid, and that's a problem. So there's different reasons that you might give, but yeah, it's a conversation that you would set up specifically. And I think how you execute the conversation depends a little bit on culture, your manager's expectations, your personality. There's not a right or wrong way to do it, but I would say that you do need to be prepared to share follow-up information afterwards in some form.
That makes a lot of sense. I think, it sounds like what you're suggesting is there's maybe two sort of paths to go down if you want to ask for this money internally. One is kind of showing that you're underpaid as compared to maybe your colleagues or the market or something. And the other is to show that your job has in some sort of material way really evolved or changed to where it's almost a new job. You've taken on management responsibility, your role has increased, something has happened, and you're no longer basically in the same role that you were when you first came into the company. Is that right?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay. In terms of, so you mentioned earlier, one important thing that people generally don't seem to do is practice. And I'm curious from your perspective, how can we go about practicing? What does that look like to practice, and how can we make it happen?
Practicing is so important because I like to say practice makes permanent, right? Because the more you do something, the better you get at it. So If you have no experience and you go in and the stakes are really high and this is the first time that you ever are going to talk about money with another human being, like you're not setting yourself up for success, you know? So I like to advise people to practice all the time in low stakes ways, like in your real life. That could mean like asking for a discount on something that's not on sale, or, you know, calling your cable company if you still have cable, or your cell phone provider to ask for a discount, even if you don't think they're going to say yes, just to like do it, just to try doing it and see how it feels to you. Or like, you know, anytime I moved somewhat recently and started negotiated aggressively with the movers for the storage unit in my building, you know, because those are relationships you don't have to maintain, right? I'm not moving again for a long time, I hope. So I don't need to be their best friend. So that's an opportunity to practice. So that's one way. But then when it comes to actually thinking about how to have that conversation, I mean, this is something that I do with my clients, but you can do it, anybody can do it with someone that they trust. That, you know, that could be a colleague, it could be a friend, a partner, whatever, a mentor, you know, to say, basically you want to practice answering the questions that you're most anxious about getting. The softball questions, you don't need to, you want to practice them, and it's fine too, but those aren't the ones you need to practice. The questions you need to practice answering are the ones that you're really worried are going to come up. So you have to pick somebody that you feel really comfortable with and give them like the download on the situation. Here's what's going on. Here's what I'm planning to ask for. Here's what I think their concerns might be, and have them do a little role play with you. So they are your boss and you are you, and you tell them what questions to ask you and you have to practice answering. So, I mean, you could do this in 10 minutes. It doesn't have to be like this agonizing all day experience, you know, It's just like say your responses out loud a couple times until you get them out fluidly so that you feel like you can talk about it without getting nervous or tripping over your words.
That makes a lot of sense. I really like your suggestion of sort of like negotiating with the movers, negotiating with the cable company, because sort of the more comfortable that you can be with this sort of feeling of conflict, and it's not literally conflict, but the more comfortable you can be with it, the easier I think it becomes kind of over time. So I'm curious, when we're switching jobs, like say we're leaving our current company and we're going to another company, the obvious thing that we usually think about is salary negotiation, so negotiating up money. But are there other things that we should also be thinking of negotiating for as we're switching jobs?
Yeah, of course. There's loads of other things. And I'm glad you brought that up, because people get so focused on the money. Obviously, it's an important part, but, you know, there's other stuff. So this could be like, what does your future growth look like? What leadership opportunities are you going to have? What professional development opportunities are you going to have? It could also be for other perks that are like maybe your company will pay your cell phone bill, or maybe there's like maybe your company has free lunch, or how many vacation days you're going to get, or commuter benefits, health insurance. I mean, there's lots of things, right? So, you know, part of it is just understanding what the options are based on the company that you're going to. But I think leadership opportunities and professional development opportunities are really good ones to talk about, because they're a little bit off the beaten path. They're not like a benefit that you're asking for, but something that benefits both you and the company, especially if you can have a little foresight about where you want to go in your career. Okay, I'm a manager now and I want to be a director in 5 years. What skills do I need to work on? And maybe this is a way to take something off your manager's plate, make them happy, and you learn something new, and it sets you up for future success. So I like to think about those kind of out of the box as well.
Those are great tips. Well, so I'm curious, one of the first things that often happens when we're going through a job interview for a new company is we get this call from the human resources rep. And they're calling to kind of set up the time when we're going to go in and meet with the hiring manager. And they ask us a couple of basic questions like, you know, why are you a good fit for this job, and that kind of stuff. And then kind of out of the blue, very often they seem to say something like, oh, by the way, how much do you make? And sometimes it feels like that question is really tricky, especially if, say, our goal is to make a lot more money in the future, or say that we're paid a lot right now and we don't mind making less in the future. Like either way, going up or down, that question can be tricky. How do you typically handle it when that HR person says, how much do you make?
Well, so in New York, where I live, it's illegal to ask that question.
I love it that it's illegal.
It's illegal in California, Massachusetts, Philadelphia. That legislation about salary history is coming to a lot of places, but
I hope
certainly
so.
not all places. Yeah, I think probably you could probably draw that. You could. There's a political element to that, right? So more liberal places are more likely to have that legislation that protects employees. So if you're not lucky enough to live in a liberal place, I'm giving my politics away here, but if you don't have that protection where you don't have to answer questions about your salary, you don't have to answer that question. I mean, they're going to make you feel like you have to. They're going to pressure you for sure. And they'll make it, really casual, like it's no big deal. But it is a big deal because the reason that we have protections now in some states and cities against asking for what your salary history is it, keeps everybody's wages down. It keeps the gender pay gap in place. It keeps the race pay gap in place. If you say, I'm making $50,000 now, they might offer you, 55 and say, well, you got an increase. You shouldn't complain. Whereas the market rate for that job might actually be 70. And if you were coming in from somewhere else, you would get 70. So it's really, really important not to give your salary history away. Even if you don't have legislative protection against that, you can turn that question around by saying, I'm not really able to discuss that. If you need a pay stub for verification purposes down the road, happy to provide that if we get to that stage. But happy to talk about salary expectations again when we get there. But right now, it's pretty early on in the process. I have a lot more things I need to learn about the opportunity before I can decide, before we can go there. And it's fine to decline multiple times. As long as you're polite and respectful, I don't feel comfortable talking about that yet. That's all you have to say. And if they are really pushy, they want to know. Of course they want to know because they're nosy. It's a data point. They keep track of it. They want to know so they can gauge. They want to set your new pay according to your old pay. That's tough cookies, in my view. And that is something that you should take note of because if you don't feel like you're treated with respect during the interview process, what is it going to be like when you work there full time? I get that that's easier said than done. Not everyone has the luxury of being like, well, I don't want this job now because they were mean to me. I understand that not everyone can do that, but I think that it is worth taking into consideration.
Yeah, it's interesting. Years ago, I was interviewing for a job in New York, and this is before the legislation was in place. And it was over the phone, and the HR person, we went through this exact dialogue where they were saying, how much do you make? And I was trying to avoid answering, and the woman got very aggressive, and she said, Angela, if you don't tell me how much you make, I'm going to end this call right now. And that's the worst that's ever happened. And I just really politely said, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I completely understand if this is part of your process, and it was great to chat with you. And blown away that I didn't sort of give in to that pressure, and we ended the call.
Good for you.
And ironically, and I don't ever expect this to happen to other people who go down this road, it was very random, but she called me the next day and said, we've decided to make an exception. And so they continued to interview me even without that information.
Of course.
Right.
Because she wants you to think that they absolutely have to have it. They're pressuring you. It's not an exception. That's ridiculous. I think. I think there are great companies out there that don't act this way. And I've certainly faced that too, where I've had, recruiters or HR people say to me, I can't move you forward in the process unless you give me this number. I don't understand why you have a problem. Everyone else gives it to me, right? With that peer pressure element. That's not respectful, and that's not how I treat other people. And that's not how I expect to be treated. And if you can't treat me with, basic human dignity and respect, then I don't need to continue this conversation with you. I'm just curious, when she came back to you and said, we've made an exception, how did you feel? Were you interested in continuing talking to them?
I think I did. It's interesting. I knew, now this is why I think it was a bit of an exception. I happened to know one of the founders of that company, and I don't think that she knew that. And I also had a very rare skill set for what they were looking for. So for me, I didn't take it terribly personally because I knew other people who worked there. I thought that it was a good place to work, and I felt like she was kind of an anomaly in the process. So for me, I didn't really take it too personally. I just wasn't going to let her push my boundary, if that makes sense. So it didn't make a huge difference to me. Well, I have one other question that I thought of as we're kind of going along, especially because you're located in New York. So I speak to people very, very frequently who live in places like Memphis, who are interested to move to big cities like New York, LA, just huge places that are a much higher cost of living. And I'll just maybe tell you my opinion, and then I'm curious to know if you have had a similar experience or if maybe you have another perspective. So very often the folks will say to me, well, I'm interested to move to New York and I only make, X amount, let's say $50,000 a year in Memphis. But I know that because of cost of living in New York is, let's say, twice as much as Memphis, I know they're going to pay me twice as much because they want me to have the same quality of life. And from my perspective, I actually think that that's not necessarily true because you have way more job seekers in New York who are competing. And I often think that you kind of have to make a choice about lifestyle. Like when I lived in LA, I lived in a tiny apartment because I wanted to live in Santa Monica and it was near the beach. And that was a personal choice that I made in order to go to that big city. So I'm curious, is that what you see from the New York side or am I wrong? Like, is the salaries in New York are just giant?
I think it varies greatly. I mean, it depends on. There certainly are giant salaries here, more giant than you might find anywhere else besides the Bay Area, which is probably even more giant. I think the Bay Area has slightly outpaced us in terms of housing costs and cost of living and salaries because of the tech industry. But we got finance here, so we got that. I mean, it depends on what you do in the industry. That's a hard question to give a straight answer to, only because the answer is it depends. There's loads and loads of people who live here on shoestring budgets that make no money. Plenty of people that are like account execs making $35,000 a year, which in New York does not go far. There's people that make, there's bankers that make, who knows, unlimited amounts. So it's hard to say. I would say that if you live if you're interviewing at or working for a company that has lots of different locations, that is a big company. Big companies do benchmark their salaries based on cost of living. So the salary that you would be offered to live in New York probably is going to be higher than the salary you would be offered to go to Memphis or to stay in Memphis. So, but I mean, depending on right, there might be other factors for your particular life, like how much, do you have a lot of savings? The cost of living is going to be higher, so you're going to have sticker shock when you try to find an apartment here. It depends. That's a hard thing to make a generalization about.
Yeah, I could see that. Absolutely. Well, Alex, where can we go to learn more about you and your work?
Askforit.co is the website, and we are AskForItCO on all the social media. So I'd love for you to check out the website, check out the blog. I write for Forbes. I have a big, deep archive on Forbes.com, so you're welcome to Google Forbes Alexandra Dickinson, and you can find me. Sign up for the newsletter, follow us on social. We share lots of community-related posts. People write in and ask questions, and I answer them, and we have guest bloggers and all kinds of things. So love to stay in touch. And I would say the website is the best place to find everything, askforit.co.
Awesome. Well, Alex, thank you for joining me. This has been excellent.
Thank you so much.
And thanks, everyone, for listening. Thanks to those of you who sent me questions. You can send me your questions to angela@copelandcoaching.com. You can also send me questions via Twitter. I'm at Copeland Coach. And on Facebook, I'm Copeland Coaching. Don't forget to help me out. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts and leave me a review.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.